Hi, I'm Katrina Daniel, and welcome to Primetime Crime, a podcast for people who want to know what goes on behind the scenes of the most notorious trending crime stories and what's going on in the minds of those involved in those stories. What are the detectives, the judges, the defense attorneys, and the prosecutors thinking? You'll hear it all on Primetime Crime, the podcast. This is Primetime Crime. I'm Katrina Daniel. And as promised, we haven't heard the last of Ghislaine Maxwell yet. A Manhattan jury found her guilty of 5 of the 6 counts against her last week, and now she's facing perhaps as many as 65 years in prison. Ben Weider, a man who's got what I think is one of the coolest jobs, investigative reporter for the vaunted Miami Herald, the paper which broke this huge Epstein story, is now with us to give us some insight into the Maxwell case that you just can't get anywhere else.
From CBS News on Prince Andrew's civil suit.
The prince denies the accusation and says he has no recollection of ever meeting Roberts Giuffre. He has never been charged with any criminal offence. But legal analyst Joe Tamburino told us in the civil suit brought by Roberts Giuffre demanding unspecified financial damages, the standard of proof is lower.
If she proves more than 50%, she wins. If she doesn't prove more than 50%, she loses.
If the trial goes ahead, the prince faces a deposition. Ghislaine Maxwell could be called as a witness, and an attorney for Roberts Giuffre says they also want to depose Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. All of it promising more dirty royal laundry.
Ben Weider, thank you so much for joining us again. We're really honored by your presence, and I mean that sincerely. Let's talk Ghislaine Maxwell. Were you surprised at the verdict last week?
I was a little surprised. I wouldn't say I was surprised that she was convicted of something, but 5 of 6 counts was pretty overwhelming. And most significantly, the last count she was convicted of, sex trafficking of a minor, that carries with it a maximum of 40 years. Woo. So as the deliberations had dragged on, it was the full day of deliberations when ultimately the verdict came. The sense was the longer the jury was taking, the better for Maxwell. In fact, even earlier in the day, Maxwell and her team had been smiling, they'd been happy. So yeah, 5 of 6 counts. I mean, that was pretty overwhelming and a pretty strong statement by the jury in terms of their sense of her guilt.
Still talking about the verdict, she was not found guilty of enticement, which surprised me because basically that's what she did. She took girls shopping, she bought them clothes, she took them on trips. That is not enticement. How did she dodge that, in your opinion?
Well, I think it was notable. I think it was connected to the first victim who testified, Jane. And Jane, I think that the defense probably did their best damage in terms of cross-examination with Jane. She was the first victim who spoke. And one of the things they really focused on was statements Jane had made to the FBI in previous years. And, basically the sort of picture they tried to paint was that her story had changed over time. And so it's possible that, her story maybe wasn't considered the strongest by the jury because of some of that work by the defense. That would be my sort of first thought, that could be part of it. Because clearly, overall, the jury believed the prosecution's case broadly. But there may have been aspects of the case that they didn't fully buy, and perhaps because of that, there was certainly a sense after the defense's cross-examination of Jane that they had had some success and landed some blows.
Okay, now you'll blame the victim because at the time she was initially interviewed by the FBI, she was really young, and her story changed as she got older. But that could go either way.
Right. I mean, I think there's a few things. I mean, one, the initial focus of any investigation would have originally been on Epstein, not on Maxwell. So, the fact that Maxwell wouldn't have been named wouldn't necessarily have been so significant. I talked to one veteran attorney who's represented some of these victims who said, he had wished that they had presented someone immediately before the first victims testified to talk about some of the challenges with memory and recollection with victims.
Yes.
They ultimately brought in people on that, but his sense was that may have prevented or sort of prepared the jury for the idea that there might appear to be some holes in some of these stories, but that doesn't necessarily mean these women aren't credible. It's just, that's the nature of recollection of sex abuse.
Or many other crimes as well. As you think about it more, facts come to light, which may or may not be facts. It could be, you could be impressed by other things that have happened in the interim. What can you tell us about Ghislaine Maxwell's maybe or maybe not cooperating? In other words, flipping on others.
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, certainly the speculation in the months, more than a year leading up to the trial was, is Ghislaine Maxwell going to flip? Many people speculated about that. We found out a few weeks before the trial started that there had never even been a discussion between prosecutors and Maxwell's team about the possibility of her flipping. Now, even though she's been convicted, she still has the right to cooperate. She can, in fact, even cooperate up to a year after her sentencing. So she can see how the sentencing went and then decide at that point that she wanted to try to cooperate. Now, the challenge with her cooperating at this point, there's a number of challenges. One, the question is, what does she bring to the table? From the perspective of, the crimes that she was convicted of, the sex trafficking crimes, she and Jeffrey Epstein were considered to be the top of the pyramid. So if she was talking about other co-conspirators, that's people further down the pyramid. Typically, you wouldn't expect her to get a great reduction in sentence for sending, an underling into prison. Then you think about, some of the other high-profile men who have been associated with Epstein and Maxwell. Prince Andrew is one of the first names that comes to mind, who's actually currently facing a civil suit brought by one of Epstein and Maxwell's victims. And, could she offer up information on some of these powerful, high-profile men? It's possible. The crime that they would be convicted of potentially is not as serious as sex trafficking. So again, what a term that that a former prosecutor told me was, prosecutors don't like the concept of cooperating down, so to speak. And, getting people on lesser crimes isn't necessarily typically going to lead to a huge reduction in sentence for Maxwell because the crimes she's been convicted of are more serious. Now, one interesting possibility is, there is a lot of mystery still about how Jeffrey Epstein made his money. We have some sense, we know some of the businessmen he's been associated with and supposedly did work for, but, is there a possibility that perhaps, she knew about some financial scheme, perhaps involving, other powerful people, perhaps not, but if she had knowledge of another crime unrelated to the sex trafficking, maybe that would be something that she could dangle to prosecutors that would get them interested. But the problem for Maxwell, basically Maxwell right now is not in the driver's seat. The prosecutors, it's up to them to decide whether they want to take any information she gives them or not. And she has to put her cards on the table before they make a decision about whether they want to accept it or not. So she would have to tell them, this is what I've got. And then they make a decision. Is that enough for us or not? She can't be coy and hold back. She has to tell them everything she knows. It also would make it very challenging for her to appeal the case. She'd have to acknowledge her guilt. She could still appeal the sentencing. So let's say she cooperated. The way cooperation works, she cooperates. The prosecutors would file a letter to say, hey, she cooperated. We think you should give her a lesser sentence to the judge. The judge doesn't have to accept it. The judge could still sentence her to the same sentence she'd be facing otherwise. She could then still, even if she cooperated, she could still then appeal the sentence that she was given if she felt it was unfair or, that her cooperation should have merited a lower sentence or for some other issue. But it would be very hard for her to appeal the verdict itself. So that is a risk that she takes. And there's a risk, too, that some of the crimes she might have information about could be beyond the statute of limitations. And so, they may be very difficult to prosecute. So she's certainly not in a great position or a position of strength when it comes to negotiating, unless, again, she has some, bombshell information that, that is going to open up, either implicate other high-profile people in very serious crimes connected to sex trafficking or otherwise. And one example that someone pointed out to me, which is an interesting example, is if you think about the Varsity Blues scandal, this was the thing where wealthy parents, including the actress Lori Loughlin, had paid money to basically get their kids into school by pretending they were athletes. So that whole investigation came about because someone in an unrelated securities fraud case, a cooperating witness said, hey,
Yeah.
I know about this other thing. And
Yeah.
so, it's possible that she could provide information about, let's say, a financial crime that occurred unrelated to the sex trafficking, but that might be enough for prosecutors to say, we're interested in that. We would recommend shaving, a number of years off of your sentence in exchange for that.
How worried do you think Prince Andrew should be?
It's an interesting question. In terms of what the legal impact on his current case, at least his civil case, the impact is minimal. Now, that's legally. If his current civil suit were to go to a jury, certainly if you're Prince Andrew, you probably wouldn't be feeling very good about your prospects after you've just seen what happened to Ghislaine Maxwell. And one of the things that Prince Andrew is arguing is that he's protected by a settlement that Virginia Giuffre, who has sued him, reached with Jeffrey Epstein in 2009, which didn't explicitly name him, but you could read it as perhaps suggesting that he was shielded from liability. Now, Maxwell herself had tried to argue in the criminal case that she was protected by a non-prosecution agreement Epstein had reached in 2007. But again, also didn't explicitly name her, but shielded co-conspirators. She didn't get anywhere with that argument in the criminal case. So you'd think that for Andrew, both the conviction and just how the Maxwell case went and the arguments she made, that wouldn't bode very well for Prince Andrew. And the prosecutors in Maxwell's case had said earlier in the proceedings that their investigation into Epstein and Maxwell and other co-conspirators was ongoing. So it's possible we'll see other charges. And your first thought might be that it might be other women who allegedly recruited and groomed girls in addition to Maxwell.
Yeah,
but
like
certainly
Sarah
some of these high-profile
Kellen.
men. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How worried should a Sarah Kellen be, who's married to a race car driver named Ian Vickers now,
Right,
and she also claims to be, she's playing the victim card too.
Right. Well, actually, it's interesting you say she's playing the victim card, because so far Maxwell hasn't done that, and that's actually an interesting question.
Right.
Maxwell has not really claimed that she was a victim. Her lawyers sort of said, oh, she was a little bit under Epstein's sway, but not to say that she was a victim, more to say that he smooth talked her the same way that he smooth talked everyone else. It is interesting to think about whether it will be interesting to see whether now as they present potential mitigating information as we approach sentencing, is that something they might try to claim now, even though they haven't done it before now. There's nothing stopping them from doing that, and it's not uncommon in these kinds of cases for women who are recruiters in sex trafficking enterprises to say, hey, I started as a victim, as Sarah Kellen has in fact. And Sarah Kellen and in general, Sarah Kellen and many other women who, are accused of having helped facilitate these crimes, Leslie Groff being one, there is a question as to whether or not they are already cooperating with the government in some capacity. Have they reached agreements of some sort? None of them testified at the trial. The government had said that potentially there would be testimony from a New York assistant who had information relating to, among other things, deleting, turning over, seizing electronic materials from Epstein's home in New York after Palm Beach police started investigating Epstein originally in 2005, and potentially was going to testify about other things involving Maxwell. They never called her to the stand. And, but it certainly there was this question when she was teased as a potential witness, there, raised this question of, are other potential recruiters or alleged recruiters going to testify? None did. That doesn't mean they aren't cooperating in some capacity. Maybe they informed aspects of the, of the charges against Maxwell. But, certainly there's it doesn't rule out the possibility that any number of them could face charges.
Do you think Ghislaine Maxwell will be put on suicide watch?
Well, I mean, she effectively has been for her entire time in custody so far.
Okay.
And in fact, that was a long-running point of contention that her lawyers raised. She talked about being subject to, multiple wellness checks every night, where they kind of flashed a flashlight in her room that made it difficult for her to sleep at night, and of being followed everywhere, and of being, subject to being, surveilled everywhere she went. And it was an interesting, there was always this interesting, interplay where on the one hand, her lawyers would argue, she should be treated like everyone else and not subject to these strict conditions, except they would also argue she needs to have more access to her computer and better computing equipment, even though she was being given more time to access her evidence than anyone else in the same facility
Really?
in New York. Yeah.
Aha.
So, yeah. So, it's an interesting question. But I would, certainly you would think that nothing about this would change that. But yeah, I mean, she was effectively held in solitary confinement. So what'll be really interesting will be, for all of her complaints about her experiences, we'll now see potentially how she likes having a roommate, which, she effectively hasn't had to have until now.
Well, it's a double-edged sword. If she were not given 24-hour surveillance and she was successful in killing herself, then her defense team would blame the government and the Bureau of Corrections, or Department of Corrections, and now they're complaining that she's not got enough privacy. What do they expect? That's ridiculous. That's a bad argument.
I think the truth of the matter is, the truth of the matter is, I mean, they made the argument time and time again that she should be released on bail, which never,
like seven times, and
right, which never succeeded. And
no.
I mean, so these were complaints that they had, but the real complaint was always that she was never released on bail, and certainly, she's currently still being held. And if you thought if the government thought she was a flight risk before she was convicted, you'd have to think she's an even greater flight risk now that she knows exactly what she could be facing. So, it's very, very, very unlikely that she would be released anytime. In fact, there are, for example, I asked the prosecutor about this. There are some people who, if they appeal their case, if they have a short sentence, they actually can make an argument that they should be released while they're awaiting the appeal. Let's say you're facing a 6-month sentence, the appeal is going to take up to a year to do. Yeah. You might say, listen, it's unfair to, make me serve my 6-month sentence if I might be successful in my appeal. Now, in her case, given that she was already considered a flight risk, it's highly unlikely that she would get any sort of reprieve in terms of being released. And I think that what we saw in her reaction to the verdict, you can't know what someone else is thinking, but certainly the enormity of the potential sentence she could be facing, does seem to have registered as she took in the verdict, and was stunned and later kind of slumped in her chair and left the courtroom without making eye contact with her siblings who had been attending the trial religiously.
Yeah, they were very loyal to her, which I find admirable on their part. But hey, what was your take on Judge Allison Nathan?
I think she tried largely successfully to sort of keep the trial from becoming a circus, which, when you have the names that are associated with Epstein and Maxwell, it certainly could have been. She had a challenging task, and this is an interesting question that, I wonder whether it will come up in appeal. You sort of got a sense as the deliberations stretched on of almost desperation or fear on her part that, Omicron and COVID could blow the whole thing up. And so, she was encouraging the jurors to deliberate longer and was really very concerned for good reason, I think, as you saw the spread in New York, and I should point out the jurors were not sequestered, so they were going home every day. So, she was really worried that the trial was going to be sort of blown up on that part. And so, I mean, if you're Maxwell's team, I would imagine that's one thing you might raise on appeal, a question as to whether you could argue that she was pressuring the jury, which, it's a delicate dance, because she would say every day, why don't you think about staying later? Of course, take all the time that you need. But at the same time was making it very clear that, she was eager for them to render a verdict given the risk that was out there. But otherwise, I mean, listen, obviously Maxwell's team has made it clear that they plan to appeal. They've started the initial steps that you would need to take to file an appeal. But I don't get the sense from talking to people that there's a sense that there was gross misconduct in how the trial was handled. It was described by many as like a fairly clean trial. So, in terms of how she handled it, and I think if you're the defense, you can point to a few things and say, listen, most of the things weren't ruled in our favor, but we did get a few victories. And one of the 6 counts was returned not guilty. You had a jury that was not completely turned against you and was willing to take contrary evidence to what the prosecutors were saying.
Talk to me if you know anything about the, I guess, below the radar divorce, end of marriage with between Ghislaine Maxwell and Scott Borgerson.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a shocker, although the marriage
Yeah.
itself was a bit of a shocker.
Right. So even her siblings.
Right. And I think there were intimations earlier that that maybe the marriage wasn't so happy even at this point, even before. So it doesn't come as a huge surprise. And I mean, I don't know if this is a motivation. I don't claim to have any knowledge, but I would imagine if your wife has been convicted of this and potentially could be facing now civil suits on top of these criminal suits, you probably want to, get your assets walled off where no one could potentially touch them, because, you have to think that, I mean, Maxwell has already faced several civil suits, but you'd have to think that there could be others coming down the road. And so, from his perspective, for any number of reasons, I mean, listen, they weren't public about this before. I don't know that now would be the time you'd want to be, publicly declaring your relationship.
Yeah, well, sure. It's the gift that keeps on giving. The Ghislaine
Indeed.
Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein.
It is.
Can I put you on a spot here?
Sure.
Do you think Epstein committed suicide?
It's an interesting question. I think, his brother maintained that he did not. And, I think the sense from a lot of people is that he did not. I mean, as to whether someone killed him or not, it's hard to say. I mean, that's the problem with any sort of conspiratorial thought, is you have to, you then have to say, well, then who actually did this? And clearly the prison guards did not do their job properly that night. There were a lot of things that didn't happen the way they should have happened. And so whether he killed himself or not, what happened was not right. And, and I think some of the complaints, I think, were quietly settled. I mean, there were a lot of problems with that. It's interesting, though. I mean, the flip side is you look at what Maxwell has just gone through, and, I don't think that Epstein would have wanted to go through that. So, that's the argument against the idea that he didn't kill himself.
Maybe my argument is that he was such a narcissist that he wouldn't harm himself. I mean, you look back at all the pictures of him, and this is interesting because he had so much money. You look back at all the pictures of him, you notice he never smiles with his mouth open.
Yeah.
Just go back and look at it. He's got these really little yellow crooked teeth.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. I mean, one of the things that was released in the trial with Maxwell was a bunch of photos of Maxwell and Epstein. And you have a lot of these photos where Maxwell is, kissing Epstein. I mean, in some cases she's, like giving him this very, sensual and sexual foot massage as well.
Yep.
But you have all these images where she's, kissing him and seems to be sort of smitten with him. And he's never really returning that.
Yeah. He's just kind of taking it. He's not emanating,
he's not
or
really giving it back.
Yeah.
And so I think, the idea, of Jeffrey Epstein as a narcissist certainly would not be surprising. And so, to that point, yes, it's certainly, it's hard to think. I mean, so much of his life was managed by other people. It's hard to see him taking his life into his own hands. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you imagine if Jeffrey Epstein wanted to do something like that, he'd have someone do it for him. So you have to do it himself.
Bring in the sheets, would you please?
Right. So yeah, it's still really hard to believe. And frankly, I think, with his death and the mystery surrounding his death, it hung over, the Maxwell proceedings.
Right.
At every turn, at every step, you just almost expected something crazy to happen. The fact that the trial actually happened, there weren't any major complications. The verdict was delivered. She's still in custody. I mean, the fact that this all happened without any major hiccups is in some ways almost surprising, given everything that had happened with Epstein.
Ben, thank you as usual for your insight. It's really enjoyable. We always feel like we're behind the curtain and we get to see what the wizard is doing.
Well, I am always happy to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to Primetime Crime, the podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Primetime Crime and on Instagram and Twitter at @PrimetimeCrime_. Post your comments and tell us what true crime stories you'd like to hear about. Subscribe to Primetime Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts. Thanks a lot.